Welcome to the National Women's Fitness Academy podcast. We're here to talk about women's health, female hormones, body image, and all things health and fitness.
Hello, girls, and welcome back to another episode of the Women's Fitness Academy's podcast. I'm your host, Sigi, one of the WFA's educators and a women's body image and mindset coach. Today, I have the lovely Demi with me. And for those who don't know Demi, she has no filter when it comes to talking about periods. And we all know how when we chat about women's health or menstrual cycle, it's the whole taboo topic. But because of this, you will know that Demi has a background in menstrual health as an educator. She's also an author, a high school teacher, and a certified fertility awareness trainer, and is also the founder of the company called Bright Girl Health. Now, Demi has presented over 15,000 students, which is amazing, empowering them to embrace their body and never dread their periods again, because we know sometimes when the period arrives and we're like, ugh, not this again. But we're going to chat all about that. And Demi also believes that your cycle shouldn't be your enemy, and it can be your greatest tool for better health and well-being. Demi, thank you so much for being here. I want us to start the conversation with, why do so many women feel as if their cycle is the enemy, instead of changing that mindset and think of it is like the greatest tool for health?
Well, isn't it what we're taught from the moment we first hear about periods as like a 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old? Our friends, family, even the media give us this message of periods equal suffering, periods equal pain. And if that's what we're taught from multiple different sources, most of us, the majority of us, just accepts that. And why wouldn't we if that's what we're being taught? And so then we get our first period, we go through puberty, we go through our teen years and into our adult years, and we find that we're still holding on to this message of periods equal suffering, periods equal miserable. But my work in schools and my work with adults online, I really try and break that mindset of I have to be miserable every month and that's just what it means to have a period. No, you don't have to be miserable. The typical acceptable period, we can accept minimal symptoms, minimal pain as our normal. It's just that that's not the message we're taught from our teenage years.
And you know what? Till today, that message is still not taught or given out enough, because we still see women saying, it's okay to feel like shit. It's okay to do this. It's okay to do that, And they're painting a really false image for women, going, oh, it is normal for me to do it. It's like, it's common, but it's not necessarily normal.
Exactly. And so if you are someone listening who feels like, I am miserable every month, I have horrible pain, or it disrupts your everyday life, then let us be the first to tell you, you don't have to accept that as your norm for the rest of your life or the rest of your menstruating life. And there are so many things that you can do in every day to make steps towards having a better period. And I know it can be discouraging when you're in the place where your periods actually aren't great right now. But let's give people lots of power and control back. There are so many things that you can do to make steps towards having a better period.
Well, let's start with the first step around this conversation to make people understand their actual cycle. Why is it important for women to track their menstrual cycles, and what should they be paying attention to when, for instance, they do experience these PMS symptoms or other symptoms such as cervical mucus?
Well, tracking your cycle, if no one ever made it really clear to you, the menstrual cycle is every single day between each period. So a lot of people say, yeah, I track my cycle, and they write down the day their period starts and the day their period stops. And that's a really great habit to have, but just tracking the days of your period, whereas the menstrual cycle is every day in between bleeds as well. Unless you are on the pill, which stops your cycle, other forms of hormonal birth control stop your cycle as well. Pregnancy, of course, stops your cycle, and before you've even got your first period, you're not cycling. But if you have a cycle, every single day of your life, you are somewhere in that cycle. And that also means that there are hormone characteristics and ways that you would expect to feel in each of the phases of the menstrual cycle. So we can break it down into 2 phases or then 4 phases. And we actually feel really different in each phase because chemically what's happening in our body with our hormones is really different. And so a lot of period tracking apps will prompt you to like put in like, I felt like this today, physically, mentally, emotionally, which can be awesome. Turn off predictions in apps because most of the time they're wrong and can cause more harm and damage and stress and worry. But turn off the predictions and use their prompts to start tracking what you're feeling in every single day. I like to break those 4 phases down into 4 animal phases because I feel like these animals represent how we might feel. So for instance, the menstrual phase, I call the sloth phase. We might feel a little slower. We might not be as productive. And hey, like that's okay. What's happening in our body at that time is that estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest point. And so we might not feel as motivated. We might not feel as energetic, but that's okay. So that's the sloth phase. And then we move out of menstruation into the lioness phase. And then we might ovulate. Hopefully we ovulate, which is the peacock phase, where we're feeling a little bit more beautiful and flirty. And then we move into the cat phase, which is the time where we typically experience PMS symptoms, where we might feel a little bit more like a cat. I feel like cats have mood swings all the time, where one minute they hate you and like 2 seconds beforehand, like they're like, yeah, rub my belly. So they also sleep a lot. And so that kind of represents this PMS phase, which doesn't have to be horrible and miserable. We can have minimal PMS symptoms, but some people have a lot. And just tracking and understanding where you are, which phase you're in, can give you so much clarity about how you might expect to feel from day to day. One week we might be able to focus on our work. We might have a lot of energy. We might be feeling really social. And then the next week, we might be feeling none of those things. We find it really hard to concentrate on our work. We find ourselves wanting to be alone more with less energy. And what do a lot of us do when we find that we feel like that? We beat ourselves up. But if you understand that this is part of the natural progression of moving through your menstrual cycle, then all of a sudden you've got so much more grace and kindness for yourself when you feel yourself feeling these things. And then you go, okay, cool. How can I support my body? What can I do to make this phase the best it can be? How do I embrace sloth life? Or how do I embrace being a cat right now? And you support your body and you work with it rather than against it.
I love the fact that you mentioned how each phase is an animal phase, because too often I've learned about the phases, and I'm sure our listeners may be familiar how it's not just one cycle, it's, split into 4s, but too often they relate it to as seasons like summer, winter, autumn, spring. But I feel as if the animal represents us so much better and you can really relate to it. And right now, both of us, we were talking just before we started recording how we're both in our lioness phase where we're just like go because we're approaching ovulation where that energy spikes up, the estrogen level is high, and you're just like wanting to get things done, which is awesome. And you also mentioned how the fact that sometimes when we don't feel in that mood and we're coming back to that other section or other half of our menstrual cycle, that's when the guilt kicks in, the shame of not being able to either lift heavier weights at the gym or run faster or work harder. And I see this a lot with clients and with women. They're generally feeling so down about themselves not being able to push harder.
Yeah, and you said guilt and shame, and aren't those just 2 of the worst feelings we could be feeling? And like, we already go through enough throughout the menstrual cycle. We shouldn't be adding guilt and shame to ourselves that we don't need to be feeling those things. I love that you mentioned that we were talking before this about like how we're both in our lioness phase, which is that phase just after bleeding has stopped, where we start to get a boost in estrogen, and therefore we also get a boost in energy and focus. But before we had even acknowledged that, we said like, how's your day? And we both said, we've been super productive. And it's just such a great alignment of like, yeah, our cycles impact our lives so much. They are our lives. We spend 7 years of our life bleeding. That's just the bleeding days, but we spend decades in the menstrual cycle. And so to ignore it is to ignore such a huge part of our lives. Anyway, so the menstrual cycle, 4 phases split into animals. I have a book called The Bright Girl Guide, and in there I break down those 4 phases and what our hormones look like in each phase and how we can expect to feel and how we can work with it. And I like the animal depiction as well rather than seasons, because seasons don't have as much of a personality as animals. And I find that for myself, it helps me to understand. I was talking to someone the other day and her husband had read my book. I'm like, yes, for supportive partners. And so when she's feeling a certain way, or when he might see that she's feeling a certain way or she's feeling different than last week, they can both go, oh, cat face, got it. And they both have this understanding of like, this is part of why you're feeling the way you are, whether it's low energy, high energy. And then there's just this mutual understanding of like, okay, cool. And this won't last. Eventually you'll be in the next phase.
Yes. And you know what, like on top of that, to mention, we want more supportive partners who understand the cycle a little bit better, and understanding that women don't work as men's biological clock. It's completely different. And I do believe that's why this shame and guilt kicks in as well, because you see males being able to work relatively hard on a 24/7 clock all the time. And you're comparing yourself to a man going, well, he's getting all of that done. Why can't I do the same? And then you're literally trying to beat yourself down to get it done, but it doesn't work, because we've just literally realized we live in a different way compared to men. And you also mentioned how our menstrual cycles impact our moods, our energy levels, and overall well-being. What are some practical ways for helping women to understand these changes a little bit better and for more of a smoother experience?
So first of all, we need to understand for each person, are your symptoms in the typical range? So you've got some mood swings, you've got some pain, you've got some emotional changes, but they're within the typical acceptable range. Or are they more on the extreme side of things? Are you getting extreme pain, extreme PMS, mood swings to the points where it's impacting your relationships and it's impacting your everyday? A good question to ask yourself to determine which camp you fit into is, are my symptoms impacting the way I live my everyday life or parts of my everyday life? If it's a yes, then you're in that camp where your symptoms aren't quite considered the typical. But the good news is there's lots you can do about it. Now, if you are in the camp where you've got more extreme symptoms that aren't typical, a good step there is connecting yourself with the right practitioner. Now, not just any practitioner, not all medical professionals have trained in menstrual cycles and hormones, and that is okay. Just like not every doctor is a heart doctor, not every doctor is a menstrual cycle doctor or a hormone expert, but your job is to find someone who is, to be able to support you the most. So that's a really important step if you fall into that camp. For those people and for the other people who have what are considered typical symptoms, there's so much you can do to support yourself with self-support strategies beyond seeing a medical professional. So I like to break it down into 4 pillars, which would be nutrition, movement, sleep and stress management. There is so much we can do within those 4 things to support our hormones to be as balanced as they can be, because it really comes down to our hormones. So if our hormones are being made in the right amounts at the right time, then we should see minimal symptoms if there's no other medical condition standing in the way. And if we're not making the right hormones in the right amounts at the right times, then that's when we see more PMS symptoms, more mood swings, more breast tenderness, leg pain, back pain, and all the things that we don't necessarily want. So do you want to dive into those 4 pillars?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. So the first one is nutrition. And I am not a nutritionist, I'll say that right up front. And so that's not necessarily something that I will dive deep into. However, what I can say is take that power that you have from choosing what you put into your body and knowing that what you choose to put into your body can be linked with your hormones and then your period symptoms that you see. So for instance, one really great example is that our body can take foods that are inflammatory and then cause us to have more pain. So there would be foods high in sugar, and then even allergy foods for some people who they know they're dairy intolerant, but they still eat dairy, and that's causing inflammation in their body, and then they see more period pain. So reducing inflammatory foods, eating enough food, especially if you're someone who trains a lot or trains really hard, we've got to be replenishing the energy that we expend. And so having enough food is really important for the body to feel safe. Because if the body doesn't have enough food, it will go into maybe we're in a famine and I can't bleed because that's not the priority if I'm about to starve. And so we want the body to feel safe enough to be able to ovulate and therefore have healthy periods and have less symptoms. Something else with food is eating a good ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats. A lot of us eat far too many omega-6 fats, which can promote inflammation and more period pain. So omega-3 fats, hemp seeds, walnuts, fatty fish, lots of omega-3 fats can also help to reduce inflammation. So nutrition can be something that we're all eating food all of the time, and so we can use it to our advantage. Another thing with food is eating lots of fiber. Fiber is going to help us have regular bowel movements, and that is how the body gets rid of hormones. So we will break them down and then we need to excrete them. However, if we're not having regular bowel movements, the body can reabsorb hormones that it was trying to get rid of, and then that can lead to hormone imbalances. So lots of fiber is a really great one, easy one, lots of fruits, veggies, nuts, seeds. So that's nutrition. And then we have movement. And this is going to be different for everyone. What everyone is capable of doing at each point in their life is going to be so different. So there's no pressure to be working out every day if that's not something that fits into your lifestyle. And I always say with everything around hormone support, as soon as it starts to cause you more stress, then it's going to be doing more harm than good, because one of the next pillars is going to be stress. So finding a consistent movement routine that works for you, that motivates you, that makes you happy, but keeps you moving your body. Not enough exercise is going to not be the best for your hormones. And what we've seen, and I'm sure everyone's seen it in their own life anecdotally, is when people are on the other extreme of the spectrum, working out, training a lot, and perhaps not replenishing that energy through nutritious foods, then they may have delayed ovulation or missing periods. And for some people, especially professional athletes, that is just part of the training schedule, and they can do things to try and support themselves. However, if you are helping your body to have regular ovulation through making sure that you are replenishing your energy that you do expend, then hopefully that would help your body to ovulate more regularly. So there's a balance, finding that sweet spot for each individual person. So that's movement. And then we've got sleep. sleep is that third pillar. Now, having good quality sleep is so important for lots of areas of health, but also for our hormones. So something that you can do to improve your sleep is getting up in the morning and getting out in the sunlight. And that can help to set your body clock to then be able to fall asleep later on in that night. Something that personally I've implemented in my sleep routine is putting a color filter on my iPhone. Do you know that that's a thing that you could do? It's not just night mode. What you can do is go into the settings and search color filter, and then you can like select a red pencil, and it can put that red filter over your screen. And you can do this on laptops too, because I know like some people just can't get around using their laptops or their phones for work or study in the evening time once the sun's gone down. Putting those filters on is so much more gentle on the eyes, and then can be so much better for our hormones as well. Having a really consistent bedtime can also be really helpful. Having blockout blinds or a really good sleep mask to make it dark in the night, so that when you are asleep, you are helping yourself to get better quality sleep as well. And then something else that can help with sleep is our fourth pillar, which is stress management. Oh my goodness, stress can be one of the body's worst enemies. And that's because when we've got so many stress hormones, our period hormones don't get prioritized. So the hormones that control our menstrual cycle, because in a stressful situation, say in a dangerous situation, our body does not go, oh, we need to bleed from our vagina. That's the priority here. No, the priority is to stay safe, to stay out of danger, and to stay alive. And like, we don't need to bleed to do that. We don't need to have babies to do that. And so what the body does really intelligently, because again, the menstrual cycle is intelligent, it pushes that down the priority list to prioritize whatever is stressing us and staying safe from that threat. So stress management is one of the biggest things you can do to support your hormones. So that might look like meditation. That might look like going out for walks. That might also look like your exercise routine. That might also look like your nutrition routine. And finding ways to cope with the stress in your life and relax and tell your body that it's safe, because that also tells your body it's safe to make the right hormones in the right amounts at the right time that will support your period.
That moment that you were talking about stress, I almost spat my water out. If you watch the video, that was a close call. All of those four pillars are so important, yet too often we don't acknowledge them enough. Especially that fourth one, the stress one. Again, we're all stressed. We all have some form of stress, whether it's work-related, social-related, relationship, personal, emotional, physical, like the list can just go on. And as you said, if we don't acknowledge it and it's neglected for long periods of time, of course it's going to affect our cycles. Of course we're going to suffer these problems of PMS symptoms and like the moodiness, or even like loss of a cycle as well. So it's very important for everyone to acknowledge what type of stress they have to be able to put these practices into place. And the sleep one is so important. My God, I remember there was a stage where I almost had like sleepless nights. And then the one simple thing that I started adding on was the filters on the phone, on my computer. And now I'm obsessed with the red filters everywhere. Even if the sun doesn't go down yet, I'm like, let's put that girl on. Like, it's completely red. So for those who are new to it, as Demi mentioned, it's on your laptop. I know it's mainly on Macs. I don't use HP, but on Macs there's color filters. And on your iPhones, again, there's a setting that you can change it to completely red. Now, for those who are like, oh, but it's red, it's going to be like so weird. It's just like, would you rather look at your screen for an hour knowing it's going to help you to fall asleep? Or are you wanting another, low quality sleep?
You get used to it too. When I first turn it on, because like I'll turn it on around the same time as the sun goes down, I'm like, oh, wow, that's so different. But after you've been looking at the screen for, say, a minute, you adjust and it just looks normal.
Yeah. And you know what? I also use the blue blocker glasses. So that's also quite handy. And again, some people are like, oh, it's so weird. It's just like, again, I'd rather take control of my health, knowing it's supporting my hormones instead of actually having more months or years of, painful symptoms.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then like a lot of these things, like having that good nighttime bedtime routine, that then kind of bleeds on into the other pillar of stress management. So you're kind of doing two in one. And for me, it's so encouraging to know that I can take these things into my own hands and support my cycle. And sometimes you'll realize if there's been a period of time where you've been slack with this stuff, it then kind of shows up in your next period or in your next PMS time, or that cat phase, where you'll go, oh, I actually had more symptoms this cycle and I wasn't doing X, Y, and Z in this cycle. And you'll see that correlation. And then so when you actually see it working, it's then more motivating to do it going forward.
100%. I completely agree with that. And again, as you mentioned, like with the sleep side of things, if we're not sleeping, getting good quality sleep, of course, it's going to bleed onto the stress. Of course, it's going to bleed into your nutrition choices, because we know when we're tired and grumpy, guess what? We're going to want more sweets. We're going to want more salty foods. And yes, that's all well and good to grab that chocolate when you want it, but is it actually going to be serving you any benefits right now? Most likely not, because you're going to be deficient in certain nutrients, as you mentioned, like the omega-3s, the fiber, the protein, the fats, and so forth. I want to talk about more as well about puberty and understanding the changes of the menstrual cycle. Again, this is such a taboo topic that many people don't speak about. And I would love to know, how can we start opening more communication and education to help women understand this cycle navigating way of thinking of transitioning periods?
Yeah, puberty is such a unique time in this. So I work with students in schools all over Australia, and the thing that I teach them as one of the first things is we look at the fact that when we start a menstrual cycle, our brain and our ovaries have to talk to each other. They have to talk to each other to make the right hormones in the right amounts at the right time. And as we just learned, if that happens, we've got minimal symptoms. If we're not making the right hormones in the right amounts at the right time, we have more symptoms. Now, before we have our very first period, our brain and our ovaries have never had to talk to each other like this before. They need to make hormones that communicate, that sends messages from like one part of the body to another for periods to happen, for ovulation to happen. And they're not very good at that. So to begin with, and it can be for the first 6 years of menstruating, as you're going through puberty and you're a teenager, menstrual cycles can be more expected to be more irregular. And it is more expected that we might see more symptoms. And this is as a result of that brain to ovary communication just being new, and your body's still getting the hang of it and learning this process. And so when we're teenagers, we might see delayed ovulation, which would result in a delayed period or a missing period. Now, after 3 months of a missing period, it's a good idea to just go have a checkup with, again, an appropriate hormonal menstrual cycle specialist to see if there's anything standing in the way of you ovulating and having a period, or if there's other supports that a practitioner can give. So yeah, 3 months plus is the timeline where it's warranted to go see someone. Teenagers might also be getting more PMS symptoms. They might be getting heavier periods, or on the flip side, they might have a really light period. So all of these things are things we want to keep an eye on. They're not necessarily ideal, but they can be more expected in teenagers, and we just want to keep our eye on them and see that they go away or start to normalize after about 6 years, hopefully before, but it can take time. Now, if any symptom is ever extreme, So it's on the extreme side of things where, again, it's impacting someone's ability to live their everyday life. Well, that's not just something that we monitor. That's when we reach out and see the appropriate specialist. So any extreme symptom, you don't have to put up with. Pain that leaves you on the bathroom floor crying, migraines, fainting, vomiting consistently, and it's not just a one-off thing, not being able to focus in class or getting so moody that you blow up at everyone in your life, all of these extreme symptoms are definitely not things that even teenagers need to put up with.
They're such useful tips for a lot of young women to understand what happens when entering puberty and, you know, getting your first cycle or the few cycles. And as you mentioned, within the 3 months, but also 6 years. And too often what we've seen in the past, and I'm assuming it's still happening today, I'm not really, you would know this best, that young girls don't get the option to actually experience that long periods of understanding and embracing their cycles because they get put on the pill.
Yes. So the pill is a very common drug prescribed, not for contraception only, but also to, in quotes, regulate somebody's period or make their heavy periods less heavy. And a really important part of incorporating a daily drug into your life is understanding how it works, understanding the pros, cons, risks, side effects, and alternatives. And that's the picture we need in order to give informed consent to something. If we don't understand how it works, how could we give informed consent? And so what a lot of people aren't told about the way that the pill works is that it doesn't actually fix or address these underlying hormone issues that are causing the heavy periods or the delayed periods. All it does is take your hormones, quote unquote, offline and replace them with synthetic hormones that do a good job of giving you a regular bleed because you take non-hormone pills on the days you want to bleed. And they can do a good job of minimizing heavy bleeds. However, you come off them and those symptoms are often still there because the pill has not addressed the root cause or fixed the root cause. Now, here's the thing. Weighing up the pros and cons, for some people, the pros might outweigh the cons. For instance, someone with endometriosis and horrible, horrible period pain to the point where they cannot get through their life, even when they're not bleeding, because endometriosis symptoms can come up between bleeds as well. And so for that person, the pill might be the way that they can function in their world and can be really, really useful while they work towards getting a long-term solution. But for teenagers who their body, their brain and their ovaries are still trying to figure out this menstrual cycle process, and that needs time and practice, putting them on the pill and taking their hormones offline, so delaying this practice, the opportunity for the brain and ovaries to communicate, isn't necessarily going to fix the problem long term. And again, this is everyone's individual decision, but everyone, I just encourage whoever's listening to do their research on how it works, pros, cons, risks, side effects, on alternatives, so that you can give informed consent. And a really great way is to, one, ask the person prescribing it. But if they don't, they're not giving you everything that you really feel like you want in order to make that decision, you can put in Google the name of whatever drug you're being prescribed. And this goes for like not even hormonal birth control, it goes for anything. And then you can type in prescribing information. What should come up as one of the first searches is a PDF of the prescribing information. So this would be an official document published by whoever's made the drug. And in that PDF, you should find how it works. You should be able to find the side effects as well. And then just asking appropriate questions of your providers, or even doing your research about what alternatives exist that do address the root cause.
I admire that so much, because when I was younger, I didn't have that option, or I didn't have the knowledge or the background of, you know, being able to go and Google and search it. I was literally got told, here, this is what you need to take. I took it. and then was on the pill for about 10 years. And once I got off it, I lost my period for a year. So again, having this extensive understanding of, hey, it's in your control whether you want to take it or not, and doing further research. And I admire that so much because, as you mentioned, too often it's pushed on you instead of actually you making the choice yourself.
Yeah, that's it. And especially for teenagers or anyone who was put on it as a teenager, you don't really think to ask these questions. But it's so important that we do, because if we're incorporating a daily drug into our lives, we do deserve to understand it. And I think a lot of people don't ask the questions, and then they don't get the answer.
100%. And you know what? We know as well that throughout our lives, our bodies and cycles fluctuate, in ways of us aging, and from a young girl to a teenager, from a teenager to adulthood, from adulthood to motherhood, or, further on, we know our cycles do change quite relatively. And that's something that a lot of women don't understand or not educated enough around this. What are some key things for women to understand or to expect when they are transitioning from puberty to adulthood?
After that first 6 years of menstruating, which we kind of think of as that like practice period for our body, we want to see the ideal period. So I'll give you a couple of characteristics of what the ideal period would look like. And if someone fits into that, awesome. If you don't fit into that, don't be discouraged, because again, there's so much that you can do to make that experience better and to move towards that typical period, and you do have a lot of control over it. So the first thing is that, we hear that a period should come every 28 days, but we're not all clones, we're not all robots, so there is a range. And so we want to be as close to that 28 days as possible, but that can be plus or minus about 5 days. We should bleed for about 4 to 7 days. So a period that's longer than 7 days is not ideal. And in the same way, less than 4 days is not ideal as well. Now, here's a really good opportunity to say not every bleed is a true period or true menstruation. So true menstruation is defined as a bleed that was preceded by ovulation. So ovulation happened about 2 weeks before you bled. And some people get bleeding for 1 or 2 days, 3 days, think it's a period, but actually it's mid-cycle spotting or a bleed for a different reason. And so that's a really important distinction to make. You can determine whether it's a true menstruation or not by tracking ovulation, and you can track ovulation with your basal body temperature and by looking at cervical mucus observations, which is definitely something we can talk about a little bit more if you'd like to. So those are the first 2 characteristics of a typical period. The third one is that it should be a rich red color. The exception to that is it can be a brown or a pink on a first or last day where it's still really light, but on our heaviest flow day, we want a rich red color, not a black, not a brown, and we don't want it to stay watery or pink beyond that first few hours of bleeding. Then we should have minimal clots. Clots can be when we get lumps in our period blood, and it can range from the size of a sultana to the size of a mandarin. If you've got mandarin-sized clots, that's your body tapping you on the shoulder, being like, hey, pay attention to me. I've got something to tell you, something that you need to look into because there's something not quite right. And a lot of us think our body's malfunctioning or our body is being super annoying, when really your body's doing you a favor. It's tapping you on the shoulder to bring something to your attention. So it's another mindset shift of, rather than seeing abnormal symptoms as frustrating or annoying, let's view them as our body doing us a favor and trying to communicate with us. So the next thing about the typical period is that it would be a minimal pain, minimal symptoms, and that ovulation should happen, as I mentioned, about 2 weeks before. So if anyone needs a refresher on high school PE class, Ovulation is when one of our ovaries releases an egg. Now, this happens once every menstrual cycle. Sometimes 2 eggs get released, and that's one of the ways that twins happens. It would always be within like the day of each other. You're not going to ovulate one week and then ovulate again the next week. But ovulation is when an ovary releases an egg. This then produces progesterone that helps our body temperature to rise only slightly. But if someone's tracking their basal body temperature daily and tracking it into an app, they'll see that shift, that temperature shift that is made after ovulation from the hormone progesterone. And then that can be a visual way to track and confirm that ovulation has happened. That then causes your period to happen about 2 weeks after. So the range is about 11 to 17 days. But if you are like, that's about a week range. But if you're tracking your cycle, what you'll realize is that you won't differ by a whole week. You should hover around the same. So if it's 14 days, 13, 14, 15 days is usually what it would be between ovulation and your period. Or you might be someone whose norm is about 16 days between ovulation and your period. And that's a really great way to bring some predictability back into periods, because that works even for people with irregular periods. Even if you're someone who only gets a period every 3 months or every 2 months, you can still track ovulation and it will still be about 11 to 17 days between ovulation and your next period.
Such a good way of looking at it. And it also takes the pressure off or the misunderstanding around the period cycle. And, you know, going back to the first conversation we had at the start, it's being able to have these conversations openly without this taboo feeling of, oh my God, I'm talking about my period again. This is weird. It's just like, no, let's educate one another and actually have an understanding of going, okay, is my body screaming for help, or am I actually functioning quite well? And you made such a good point around the clotting, because that's something that's quite common with women. And that you said, you know, sometimes it goes from a sultana to a mandarin. And I'm like, fuck, a mandarin, that would be such a big clot.
Yeah, huge. I've known people who have experienced that and they've done the right thing. They connected with the appropriate professional and were able to get a diagnosis. And a lot of the times that can be connected with endometriosis or a thyroid condition. And the overwhelming feeling from those people that I've talked to who have experienced this, once they get their diagnosis, they're like, oh my gosh, it's such a relief, because I now have an answer for why I've had these horrible period symptoms. And you would think that it's a bit scary to get a diagnosis, and it can be before you get it. But once you get it, you then have answers. It's not all in your head, these symptoms, and you then get a way forward to move towards a better period experience.
And hopefully a lot of our listeners are going, oh, it wasn't in my head. This is actually happening for a reason. And as you mentioned, it's noticing the symptoms that you are experiencing. And if you need a further diagnosis, it's going to a specialist who does work within that realm.
Yes, that's such a good point. I created a specialist directory on my website, because that can be one of the hardest things to actually find the right person. And then it can be expensive as well. It is a bit of an investment, and not everyone has the luxury of being able to afford that as well. And so for a lot of people, their GP is the first step, and it's also a great step. And if they can help you, if they can even point you towards a specialist, and then you can hopefully get a little bit of a rebate because they've pointed you towards them, that's great. I've got a practitioner directory on the Bright Girl Health website because I know so many people struggle to find the right person. So on this directory, you can search by category of like what your concerns are. So PCOS, endometriosis, heavy periods, teenage periods, acne, and whatever it is. And then you can also search by like type of practitioner. So gynecologist, endocrinologist, GP. And so I hope that's helpful for people if they are trying to find someone to help them with their symptoms.
Yeah, definitely. I will pop it in the showcase notes for everyone who wants to have that further research around it, and also have a look at your website and further of what you do. Demi, thank you so much for jumping on today. This conversation has been so insightful, and I know a lot of our listeners are going to get a lot of value and feel a little bit more at ease right now, knowing that they're not alone in this. And it's super common to have these symptoms or these thoughts that pop up in their heads during these months of their cycle.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Like, you are totally not alone. There are so many people in the world that have a period. And so there is lots of support and resources available. So go do your research, take control of your hormones, and turn your period into something that becomes a superpower in your life rather than an annoyance.
Totally agree with that. Well, girls, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please make sure that you screenshot it, tag us at the Women's Fitness Academy. And then till next time, let's take the power within us to look further into our periods.